It was a busy Monday morning at City General Hospital, and Dr. Morrison was already in a foul mood. The air conditioning wasn't working properly, his coffee had gone cold, and the stack of patient files on his desk seemed to grow taller by the minute. Running his fingers through his graying hair, he picked up the next file without even looking up when he heard the door open. A soft-spoken voice broke the silence. "Good morning, doctor. We're here for my daughter. She's been having severe stomach pain since last night." The woman's voice was filled with concern, but Dr. Morrison barely acknowledged her presence, his eyes still fixed on the paperwork. When he finally glanced up, his entire demeanor shifted subtly but noticeably. The 12-year-old girl sat on the examination table, clutching her stomach, her face twisted in pain. Her mother stood beside her, well dressed in a business suit, though Dr. Morrison seemed to look right through her professional appearance. "Insurance?" he asked bluntly, cutting off the mother's attempt to explain the symptoms. His tone was notably different from the friendly voice that had greeted his previous patient just minutes earlier. The mother pulled out a premium insurance card, but his expression remained unchanged. "She probably just ate something that didn't agree with her," he muttered, barely listening as the mother tried to explain that her daughter hadn't been able to keep any food down for the past 24 hours. He typed dismissively on his computer, his questions becoming increasingly condescending. The young girl winced as another wave of pain hit her. "It really hurts, Mom," she whispered, tears forming in her eyes. But Dr. Morrison continued his rapid-fire questioning, focusing more on their family history and living situation than the actual symptoms. A young nurse passed by the open door, pausing briefly as she noticed the doctor's unusual behavior. She had seen him spend nearly 30 minutes with his previous patient, discussing symptoms in detail, but now he seemed determined to rush through this appointment. The mother, maintaining her composure despite the doctor's attitude, pulled out her phone and began recording the time and details of their visit. She was no stranger to documenting important moments, and something about this interaction felt wrong on every level. "Well, it's probably just indigestion," Dr. Morrison concluded after a cursory examination that lasted less than 5 minutes. "Give her some over-the-counter antacids and make sure she drinks plenty of water." He was already turning back to his computer, clearly dismissing them. "But doctor," the mother pressed, her voice firm but polite, "she's never experienced pain like this before. She's an active child, plays basketball, and has never had stomach issues. Something feels different this time." Dr. Morrison's response was to hand them a generic information sheet about upset stomachs. "If it gets worse, you can always visit the emergency room," he said, his tone suggesting he didn't think it would be necessary and that they'd be wasting everyone's time if they did. What Dr. Morrison didn't know, as he ushered them out of his office, was that this seemingly routine appointment would soon become a turning point in his career. He had no idea that his actions in these few minutes would set off a chain of events that would force him to confront his deepest biases and challenge everything he thought he knew about being a doctor. Little did he know that the quiet, professional mother he had so quickly dismissed was carefully documenting every word, every dismissive gesture, building a case that would soon land on the desk of someone who had the power to change everything at City General Hospital. Back in the waiting room, the young girl's pain was getting worse. She sat hunched over in one of the uncomfortable plastic chairs while her mother tried calling their family doctor for a second opinion. The mother couldn't shake the feeling that something was seriously wrong with her daughter. Through the open door of his office, Dr. Morrison could be heard laughing with another patient, his voice warm and engaging, completely different from the cold tone he had used just minutes before. A few nurses exchanged knowing looks, having seen this pattern before but feeling powerless to address it. "Mom, I really don't feel good," the girl whispered, her face growing pale. The mother placed her hand on her daughter's forehead, feeling the heat radiating from her skin. The fever that hadn't been there during their brief examination was now climbing rapidly. The mother approached the front desk again, her calm exterior masking her growing anxiety. My daughter's condition is getting worse, she explained to the receptionist. Her fever is rising, and the pain is increasing. Could we please see Dr. Morrison again? The receptionist, clearly sympathetic but constrained by protocol, knocked on Dr. Morrison's door. Without even stepping out to check on the child, he called out, "Give them some Tylenol samples from the cabinet. If they're still concerned, they can go to urgent care." A young nurse, who had been watching the situation unfold, quietly approached the mother. "I've been monitoring your daughter from my station," she whispered. "I'm documenting everything I'm seeing. This isn't right." The mother nodded gratefully, already having filled several pages of notes on her phone. In his office, Dr. Morrison was taking his time with other patients, ordering detailed tests and scans for symptoms far less severe than the young girl's condition. He barely glanced out his door when he heard the commotion beginning to build in the waiting room. The mother, still maintaining her professional demeanor, continued recording everything on her phone: the timestamps, the different treatment of other patients, the dismissal of her concerns. She had learned long ago the importance of documenting discrimination, though she had never expected to need these skills in a hospital. Other patients in the waiting room began to notice the deteriorating condition of the young girl. An elderly woman offered her water, while a businessman gave up his more comfortable seat. The community forming in the waiting room stood in stark contrast to the doctor's indifference. The young nurse kept finding excuses to check on them, taking the girl's temperature and vital signs while trying to stay under Dr. Morrison's radar. 103.2. She muttered under her breath, shaking her head with concern. She had seen enough to know this was more than just indigestion. Through the thin walls, they could hear Dr. Morrison discussing weekend golf plans with another patient, scheduling follow-up appointments for minor ailments while the young girl's condition continued to worsen. The contrast in care was becoming more apparent by the minute. The mother's phone kept buzzing with messages from her husband, asking for updates. She replied carefully, not wanting to worry him unnecessarily, but knowing he needed to be informed of everything that was happening. What Dr. Morrison didn't realize was just how significant those text messages would soon become. Time seemed to slow down in the waiting room as the young girl's pain intensified. The mother held her daughter close, watching the clock and documenting every minute that passed without proper medical attention. She knew that every detail she recorded could make a difference, not just for her daughter, but for others who might face similar treatment. Little did Dr. Morrison know that his actions, or rather, his lack of action, over these crucial minutes would soon come under intense scrutiny. The carefully documented evidence of his selective treatment would become part of a much bigger story, one that would shake the very foundations of his professional world. Everything happened in a flash. One moment, the young girl was leaning against her mother in the waiting room, and the next, she slumped forward, her small body crumpling toward the floor. The mother's quick reflexes caught her before she hit the ground, but the girl's eyes had rolled back, and she wasn't responding. "Help! Somebody help my daughter." The mother's composed demeanor finally cracked as she cradled her unconscious child. The waiting room erupted into chaos. Other patients jumped to their feet, some calling for help, while others ran to find medical staff. The young nurse who had been keeping an eye on them sprang into action. She didn't even bother alerting Dr. Morrison this time. Instead, she hit the emergency call button and radioed directly to the ER. Code blue in the clinic waiting room. Pediatric patient, approximately 12 years old, unconscious. Within seconds, the double doors burst open as the emergency response team rushed in with a gurney. The mother's hands shook as she helped them lift her daughter onto it, her phone still automatically recording everything as it had been for the past hour. Dr. Morrison finally emerged from his office, looking irritated at the commotion. His expression changed slightly when he saw the unconscious girl, the same one he had dismissed earlier as having mere indigestion. He started to approach, but the emergency team was already moving swiftly toward the ER. "What's her blood pressure?" one of the ER doctors called out as they rushed down the hallway. The numbers that came back were dangerously low. The mother ran alongside the gurney, still clutching her phone, answering questions rapid fire about her daughter's medical history. Back in the waiting room, patients who had witnessed everything were furious. The elderly woman who had offered water earlier was telling anyone who would listen about how the girl had been ignored. The businessman who had given up his seat was already on the phone with hospital administration. The young nurse quickly printed out all the vital signs she had documented over the past hour, showing a clear progression of the girl's worsening condition. She handed these records directly to the ER team, deliberately bypassing Dr. Morrison, who stood watching from the clinic doorway. Things moved quickly in the emergency room. Blood tests were ordered immediately. X-rays were taken. Every test that should have been done hours ago was now being rushed through with urgent priority. The mother stood by, watching as multiple doctors and nurses worked to help her daughter. In the clinic, Dr. Morrison returned to his office, but things had changed. The waiting room had become hostile territory. Patients who had witnessed the incident were refusing to see him, demanding other doctors. Some were openly using their phones to record the aftermath of the situation. The young nurse was no longer being quiet about her concerns. She was openly sharing her documented observations with the hospital supervisors who had arrived to investigate the incident. Her hands trembled slightly as she spoke, but her voice was clear and firm as she described the pattern of selective treatment she had witnessed. Time seemed to simultaneously race and crawl in the emergency room. Every beep of the medical equipment, every hurried conversation between medical staff, every moment her daughter remained unconscious felt like an eternity to the mother. She continued recording, her phone now serving as both a diary and a witness to everything unfolding. The tension in the air was electric when the elevator doors opened at the end of the hallway. The figure who stepped out would change everything. But Dr. Morrison, still sitting in his office trying to continue his regular appointments as if nothing had happened, wasn't prepared for what was coming next. The mother's phone buzzed one final time. Reading the message, she took a deep breath, knowing that the next few minutes would change not just this hospital, but potentially how countless other patients would be treated in the future. The true impact of Dr. Morrison's actions was about to become crystal clear. The emergency room fell silent as a tall, distinguished man in a perfectly tailored suit stepped through the doors. His presence commanded immediate attention, but it was the look of controlled fury on his face that made everyone stop in their tracks. This was the hospital's new chief of surgery, and the unconscious young girl was his daughter. Nobody had expected him to arrive so quickly. He'd have been in a board meeting when his wife's texts started coming in, each message painting a clearer picture of what was happening. He had listened to the voice recordings she sent, watched the video clips, all while sitting quietly at the conference table, his anger building with each passing minute. "Status report," he demanded, his voice calm, but carrying an edge that made the medical team snap to attention. The ER doctor quickly ran through their findings: severe appendicitis, possibly close to rupturing. The chief's expression darkened as he heard how long his daughter had been showing symptoms, and how they had been dismissed. Down the hall, a nurse hurried into Dr. Morrison's office. "Sir, you need to come to the ER immediately." Dr. Morrison waved her off, claiming he was with a patient. The nurse persisted. "The chief of surgery is asking for you specifically." Something in her tone made Dr. Morrison finally look up, and the color drained from his face. The walk to the emergency room felt like the longest of Dr. Morrison's life. He could hear whispers following him, see the looks from staff members who had witnessed the earlier events. His mind raced, trying to remember exactly what he had said and done during that brief examination. When he pushed through the ER doors, the chief of surgery was reviewing his daughter's test results. Without looking up, the chief spoke, his voice carrying across the suddenly quiet room. "Dr. Morrison, please explain to me why my daughter's obvious appendicitis symptoms were dismissed as simple indigestion." Dr. Morrison opened his mouth, but no words came out. The young nurse who had been monitoring the situation stepped forward, holding her detailed notes. Security footage from the waiting room played silently on a nearby monitor. The mother's phone recordings sat on the counter, evidence of every dismissive word and gesture. I didn't realize, Dr. Morrison stammered, but the chief cut him off. Didn't realize what? That she needed immediate medical attention. Or didn't realize who her father was? Which answer would make your actions more acceptable? The chief's voice remained measured, but his words cut deep. He pulled up the hospital's patient care records on a computer screen. Let's review your patient histories from the past month. Interesting pattern here, wouldn't you say? The data showed a clear disparity in how long Dr. Morrison spent with different patients, what tests he ordered, and how seriously he took their complaints. Other hospital staff watched silently as their chief of surgery methodically laid out the evidence. Not just from today, but from weeks of patient records, showing a pattern that nobody could deny. Dr. Morrison seemed to shrink with each passing minute, his previous arrogance melting away. In a nearby operating room, a surgical team was preparing to remove the young girl's inflamed appendix. A simple procedure that could have been dangerous if left any longer. The mother stayed by her daughter's side, still recording everything, knowing that this moment would have ripple effects far beyond their family. The chief turned to face Dr. Morrison directly. You'll be happy to know my daughter will recover. No thanks to you. Now we need to discuss how to make sure this never happens to anyone else's child. His words carried the weight of both professional authority and personal anguish. The atmosphere in the ER was thick with tension as everyone waited to see what would happen next. Dr. Morrison stood there, finally forced to confront the consequences of his actions, while the chief contemplated how this moment could transform not just one doctor's behavior, but an entire hospital's approach to patient care. The chief of surgery's office was eerily quiet as he closed the door behind them. Dr. Morrison sat stiffly in the chair across from the desk, his usual confidence completely gone. On the desk between them lay a stack of patient files, hospital records, and the mother's phone still recording every moment. Let's go through this step by step, the chief began, his voice level but intense. Tell me exactly what happened when my daughter first came to your office. He pressed play on one of the recorded clips, and Dr. Morrison flinched at the sound of his own dismissive tone. As they listened to the recordings, the chief made notes, occasionally pausing to ask questions. Why did you spend only 4 minutes with her, when your previous patient was given 30 minutes for a minor rash? Each question stripped away another layer of Dr. Morrison's excuses. The young nurse who had helped document everything was called in to share her observations. She spoke clearly, describing how she had watched Dr. Morrison's behavior change dramatically depending on which patients he was treating. Her detailed notes showed a clear pattern that couldn't be explained away. Do you know what happens to a burst appendix? The chief asked suddenly, pulling out graphic medical images on his computer screen. The infection spreads through the abdomen. Hours can mean the difference between a simple procedure and a life-threatening situation. Dr. Morrison's face grew pale as he looked at the images. Down the hall, in the operating room, surgeons were successfully removing the girl's inflamed appendix. The procedure was routine, but everyone knew how close they'd come to a much worse situation. The mother watched through the observation window, still recording everything for what she knew would become an important record. Back in the office, the chief pulled out more files. These are complaints from other patients, he said quietly. Most of them never made it past the front desk because people felt powerless to challenge a doctor. The stack of folders was disturbingly thick. Dr. Morrison tried to defend himself. I treat all my patients the same. But his voice trailed off as the chief pulled up the hospital's electronic records, showing clear statistical evidence of different treatment patterns. The numbers didn't lie. Appointment times, ordered tests, and referral rates all showed significant disparities. Here's what's going to happen, the chief said, leaning forward. You have 2 choices. One, you can clean out your office right now. He paused, letting that sink in. Or two, you can be part of fixing this problem, not just for my daughter, but for every patient who walks through those doors. Security footage from the waiting room played silently on the screen, showing the young girl's collapse and the chaos that followed. Dr. Morrison watched himself in the video, standing in his office doorway, initially more annoyed and concerned about an unconscious child. The chief pulled out a final document. This is a new hospital initiative on bias awareness and equal care standards. It needs someone to lead it, someone who understands firsthand how dangerous unconscious bias can be in medicine. His words hung in the air, both a challenge and an opportunity. Outside the office, hospital staff went about their duties, but everyone knew something important was happening behind that closed door. The young nurse who had helped document everything shared quiet looks with her colleagues, all of them hoping this would lead to real change. Through the window, they could see the chief gesturing at papers on his desk, his face serious but not angry. Dr. Morrison sat slumped in his chair, looking at something in his hands. A copy of his own patient care statistics that told an undeniable story of discrimination. The choice he would make in the next few minutes would affect not just his own future, but the future of countless patients who would come through the hospital's doors. The question was, would he accept the opportunity to learn from this mistake, or would he continue to deny the reality of his actions? Alone in his office that evening, Dr. Morrison sat staring at the files spread across his desk. The hospital had grown quiet, but his mind was louder than ever. Each patient file told a story, not just of medical conditions, but of his own biases he'd never wanted to acknowledge. He picked up a photo from his desk, one taken at his medical school graduation. Young, idealistic, hand raised in the Hippocratic Oath. First, do no harm. Had he really strayed so far from that promise? His reflection in the dark window looked older, more troubled than the smiling graduate in the photo. The chief's words kept echoing in his mind. Your actions today almost cost a child her life. But it wasn't just about today. The statistics lying on his desk showed years of patterns. Shorter appointment times, fewer tests ordered, less follow-up care, all based on unconscious assumptions he'd made about certain patients. Down in recovery, the young girl was waking up from surgery, her father now sitting beside her bed, not as the chief of surgery, but simply as a worried dad. The mother shared the recordings with the hospital board, her hands steady as she played clip after clip of similar incidents she gathered from other patients. Back in his office, Dr. Morrison opened his computer and began searching through medical journals. Articles about healthcare disparities jumped out at him. Studies showing how unconscious bias affected medical decisions, statistics about different health outcomes based on prejudice. He'd seen these articles before, but had always scrolled past them. The young nurse who had documented everything knocked on his door, carrying more patient files. Instead of dismissing her like he usually would, he invited her in. Tell me what you've seen, he said quietly. For the next hour, she shared stories of patients who had felt ignored, dismissed, or disrespected. Each story hit him harder than the last. He remembered a young mother he'd accused of exaggerating her child's symptoms. The child had later been hospitalized for pneumonia. An elderly man whose chest pain he dismissed as anxiety. The man had suffered a minor heart attack later that day. The weight of his actions pressed down on him as he realized how many lives he might have affected. His prestigious medical degree, hanging on the wall, seemed to mock him now. What good was all that knowledge if he let his prejudices override his training? He pulled out a notepad and began writing. First, a list of every patient he needed to review and contact. Then, ideas for changes in his practice, standardized assessment forms, regular review of his patient care statistics, better documentation of his decision-making process. The clock ticked past midnight as he worked. On his computer screen, he pulled up information about bias training programs, medical equity initiatives, and community healthcare outreach projects. The chief had offered him a chance to be part of the solution. He had to prove he deserved that opportunity. Looking out his window at the quiet hospital parking lot, he thought about all the patients who would come through these doors tomorrow, next week, next year, each one deserving the same high standard of care, regardless of who they were or what they looked like. The folder containing his patient care statistics sat open on his desk, numbers that couldn't be explained away. But maybe they could be changed. Maybe this awful day, this harsh wake-up call, could be the beginning of something important, not just for him, but for every patient who would trust him with their care. Finally, he began drafting an email to the chief, outlining his plans for change. His hands shook slightly as he typed, knowing these words needed to be more than empty promises. They needed to be the first step in a complete transformation of how he practiced medicine. 6 months passed, and the changes in Dr. Morrison were impossible to miss. His office, once a place of rushed appointments and quick dismissals, had transformed. The walls now displayed posters about health equity and patient rights in multiple languages. But the real changes went much deeper than decoration. The waiting room buzzed with a different energy now. Patients who had once felt ignored or dismissed found themselves being heard. Dr. Morrison's appointment slots were longer, his manner more attentive. The young nurse who had documented his previous behavior now worked closely with him, helping implement new patient care protocols. Every week, he attended training sessions, not just as a participant, but as someone eager to learn. He sat in the front row, taking notes, asking questions, and sharing his own experiences of recognizing and confronting his biases. His story became a powerful teaching tool, a real-world example of how prejudice could cloud even a trained medical professional's judgment. In community health meetings, he was often the first to speak up about healthcare disparities. He shared anonymous versions of his past cases, using them to illustrate the dangerous consequences of bias in medical decisions. His honesty about his own mistakes made others more willing to examine their own practices. The chief's daughter had fully recovered, but her case had sparked a hospital-wide revolution. Dr. Morrison worked with the administration to create a new patient feedback system. Every exam room now had a QR code that patients could scan to report their experiences, good or bad, directly to hospital management. One morning, during a staff meeting, Dr. Morrison presented the latest patient care statistics. His own numbers showed a complete transformation. Appointment times were now consistent across all patients. Testing was ordered based on symptoms rather than assumptions, and patient satisfaction scores had soared. He started mentoring younger doctors, sharing his journey from bias to awareness. "Look at the patient, not your preconceptions," he would tell them. "Every symptom deserves the same careful attention, regardless of who describes it." His past mistakes became valuable lessons for the next generation of medical professionals. The mother's recordings had become part of the hospital's training materials, with her permission. New staff members watched them during orientation, learning how subtle bias could appear and how devastating its consequences could be. Dr. Morrison himself often introduced these sessions, standing before his colleagues with humility and purpose. In his private moments, he sometimes looked at his old patient files, reminding himself of how far he'd come and how far he still needed to go. Each file represented not just a medical case, but a human being who had trusted him with their health, a trust he had once betrayed but was now working hard to deserve. The young nurse stopped by his office one evening, carrying new patient satisfaction surveys. "Remember when I used to document your mistakes?" she asked with a small smile. "Now I'm documenting your successes." The pile of positive feedback had grown impressively over the months. During rounds, other doctors noticed how he took time with each patient, asking detailed questions and listening carefully to their answers. His example inspired changes throughout the hospital. Other departments began examining their own practices, leading to widespread improvements in patient care. His transformation attracted attention beyond the hospital walls. Healthcare newsletters wrote about the changes he'd implemented. Other hospitals began asking him to share his experience, wanting to learn from both his mistakes and his journey to correct them. But for Dr. Morrison, the real reward came in the small moments. The grateful smile of a patient who felt truly heard, the trust in people's eyes when they knew they would receive proper care, the knowledge that he was finally living up to the oath he'd taken when he first became a doctor. Dr. Morrison stood at the podium, looking out at the packed conference hall. Medical professionals from hospitals across the country had gathered to hear him speak about transforming healthcare culture. As he adjusted the microphone, he noticed the chief and his wife sitting in the front row, their daughter, now healthy and strong, beside them. A year ago, he began, his voice steady, I almost lost a young patient because of my own biases. The room fell silent. Today, I'm not here to defend those actions. I'm here to show you how one incident changed not just my practice, but an entire hospital's approach to patient care. The screen behind him displayed the patient care statistics, showing dramatic improvements over the past year. But it wasn't just numbers. He shared real stories, with permission, of patients who had received better care because of the new protocols he'd helped develop. During the presentation, he played clips from training sessions he'd conducted, showing doctors learning to recognize their own unconscious biases. The audience watched intently as he demonstrated the simple but effective changes they'd implemented: standardized questionnaires, regular care reviews, and patient feedback systems. In the middle of his talk, a doctor raised her hand. How do you handle resistance from staff who don't think they have any biases? She asked. Dr. Morrison smiled sadly, remembering his own initial denial. He shared how they'd use real patient data to help doctors recognize patterns in their own practice they hadn't noticed before. The young nurse who had documented his past mistakes was now leading her own training sessions at other hospitals. She sat in the audience, nodding as he described their new mentoring program for medical students. Sometimes, he explained, the best teachers are those who've learned from their mistakes. After the main presentation, he led a workshop where doctors examined their own patient care statistics. The room buzzed with discussion as medical professionals discovered patterns in their own practices they'd never noticed before. Many looked troubled, reminded of similar incidents from their own experience. During the lunch break, doctors crowded around him, sharing their own stories and asking for advice. One older physician admitted, with tears in his eyes, that he'd seen similar behavior in his practice for years but had never known how to address it. Dr. Morrison listened, offering practical suggestions based on his experience. Back at their own hospital, the changes continued to spread. The emergency room had implemented new triage procedures to ensure consistent care for all patients. The pediatric department had created child-friendly feedback tools to help young patients and their families report their experiences. The mother's original recordings had become part of a larger project. With identifying details removed, they were used in medical schools to teach future doctors about the importance of checking their biases. Students watched them and discussed how they would handle similar situations differently. That evening, after the conference, Dr. Morrison sat in his office looking at a new batch of patient feedback forms. Each positive comment reminded him of how close he'd come to losing everything because of his prejudices. But each one also showed him that real change was possible. His phone buzzed with a message from the chief's daughter. She was doing great in school and thinking about becoming a doctor herself. Her experience had inspired her to want to help others, showing how even the darkest moments could lead to positive change. As he gathered his things to head home, he passed the wall of patient thank you notes that had slowly accumulated over the past year. Each one represented a person who had received the care they deserved, the care that every patient should have received from the beginning. A bright morning sunlight streamed through the hospital windows as the chief's daughter walked into the clinic for her one-year checkup. The waiting room looked different now, more welcoming, with signs in multiple languages and a diverse staff that reflected the community they served. Dr. Morrison, now the hospital's director of equitable care, sat across from his former patient, marveling at how one critical moment had changed so many lives. The young girl was thriving, active in sports again, and had even started a student group at her school focusing on healthcare awareness for young people. "How are you feeling?" he asked, giving her his full attention. The same attention he now gave every patient who walked through his door. She smiled, sharing stories about her school activities and her dreams of medical school. Her mother sat beside her, no longer recording on her phone. She didn't need to anymore. The appointment wasn't rushed. Dr. Morrison took time to answer all their questions, just as he did with every patient now. Through the open door, they could hear the busy sounds of a hospital transformed. Staff members greeting patients warmly, nurses taking time to listen, doctors explaining things carefully and clearly. Down the hall, new doctors were going through orientation. Through the window, Dr. Morrison could see them watching those old recordings, his greatest mistakes now serving as powerful teaching tools. But instead of feeling shame, he felt purpose. Every new doctor who learned from his story meant countless patients who would receive better care. The young nurse who had once documented his bias now ran the hospital's patient advocacy program. She stopped by during the checkup, sharing updates about their latest initiatives. The program had expanded to other hospitals, creating a network of healthcare providers committed to equal care for all patients. After the appointment, Dr. Morrison walked with the family to the lobby. The chief joined them, no longer just an authority figure, but a partner in creating lasting change. Together, they had built something remarkable, a hospital where every patient could expect the same high standard of care, regardless of who they were. In the afternoon, Dr. Morrison led a meeting with community leaders, discussing ways to further improve healthcare access. The mother's recordings had sparked a movement that went far beyond one hospital. Other medical centers were adopting their protocols, creating a ripple effect of positive change throughout the healthcare system. Later, reviewing patient satisfaction scores, Dr. Morrison noticed something remarkable. The disparities in care that had once been so glaring had virtually disappeared. The numbers told a story of transformation, not just in statistics, but in real human lives affected every day. A new batch of medical students arrived for their rotation, eager to learn. Dr. Morrison shared his story with them, not as a cautionary tale, but as proof that change was possible. Your biggest mistakes, he told them, can become your greatest opportunities to make things right. The day ended with a community health fair in a hospital parking lot. Families from all backgrounds felt comfortable seeking care, knowing they would be treated with respect and dignity. The barriers that had once seemed so insurmountable had been replaced by bridges of understanding and trust. As the sun set, Dr. Morrison stood at his office window, watching people leave the health fair. Each person represented a promise kept, a promise to provide equal care to every patient. The young girl's case had been a turning point, but the real victory was in the thousands of patients who would never have to experience what she did. The final light of day cast long shadows across the hospital grounds, but inside, the lights stayed bright. Another night shift was beginning, another chance to prove that the changes they'd made would last. In the end, it wasn't just about fixing one doctor's mistakes. It was about creating a new standard of care that would touch countless lives for years to come.